get this to work. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Get this in my pocket. It's a pleasure to be back with you again. I've had the honor of speaking to the Chicago Roundtable twice before, and I'm hoping I do well tonight because you come with me again later in the year. I'm given the unique honor of opening your season and closing it in June. And so what I've done, I've taken what I consider a very important story, which is the capture of the city of New Orleans and its occupation by Benjamin Butler, and divided it into two different lectures and run one on top of another. Tonight we're going to talk about the time period from the beginning of the war. Obviously you don't want to move in that direction. From the beginning of the war until May the 1st, when Butler's troops landed at the base of Canal Street. And then in June I'll come back and I'll talk to you about the 7 months between May and December of 1862 and the Union occupation of New Orleans. Why did this begin to interest me? You heard some of my resume. By the way, 10 years of my career was spent in Louisiana, managing the Chalmette battlefield, which is the Battle of New Orleans, site of the War of 1812. And then I put together a series of Acadian cultural centers in the towns of Lafayette, Eunice, and Thibodaux. But during that time, I fell in love with Louisiana. Louisiana and New Orleans are different than any other places on the face of this earth. And for those of you that have never had the pleasure of being in Louisiana or being in New Orleans, I cannot urge you, when I don't get any kind of a kickback from the local visitors bureau, but I urge you all to visit it. Unfortunately, nature is going to take its course. The forts I'm going to be talking about tonight, New Orleans itself could very easily, if it takes another direct hit from another 4 or 5 level hurricane, could very easily be gone forever. So I urge you to visit the state of Louisiana and New Orleans, and enjoy its magnificent and unique culture, food, music, everything about it. But when I went down there, you heard my resume. I had worked at Gettysburg, at Fort Sumter, and Chickamauga. I knew a lot about what we would call the more well-known battlefields, the more well-written battlefields, the Eastern Theater, the Upper Midwestern Theater. I knew nothing about the Civil War in Louisiana. What got me started on this is shortly after I arrived, a good friend of mine had taken me to dinner at a plantation house upriver from New Orleans, still owned by the same family that owned it during the Civil War. Dinner was absolutely wonderful, and at about the end, as dinner was ending, the children of the family got loose from their babysitter and started running around where the adults were. They were just absolutely out of control. Babysitter chasing them around the dining room. And they just, no matter what the babysitter did, these kids would not calm down. But then the babysitter blew a gasket and finally said, if you do not behave right now, General Butler is going to come get you tonight. And those kids snapped to. And I said, I need to learn more about this. How on earth could an event 150 some years ago trigger this kind of, this kind of reaction? And still, you would think a boogeyman had been mentioned. I said, I need to learn more about New Orleans and the story of the lower part of the Mississippi River. And I've got to be real careful tonight because not only I have 2 magnificent, wonderful former Louisiana State Park Rangers, your own Larry Hewitt, and of course my wife, who if I make any mistakes about Louisiana, they're going to be on me real quickly. So I feel I've got a unique critique going on here. So I want to talk to you a little bit about New Orleans itself. In 1860, I had the pleasure, when living down there, to meet a gentleman who was a writer for the Times-Picayune and a historian. His name was Charles, nicknamed Pye Dufour. He had written what is, I consider, the best book, a copy of which is up on the table here, about the capture of New Orleans. What Pye wrote in that book is the quote I'm going to begin with, which gives you an idea of what we'll be talking about. He's writing about New Orleans. New Orleans, by nature of its French founding and Spanish rule, was not a typically southern city. Its cosmopolitanism, however, had never been so pronounced as it was in the census of 1860. Its total population was 168,675, counting 64,621 foreign-born from more than 30 nations. Why New Orleans? Population of almost 170,000. Where does that rank in size in the Confederacy? By far the largest. Can anybody name the second largest? Tie. Charleston and
wherever the Union Army was.
Richmond. Anybody want to guess how big they were?
40,000.
Between 40, I've seen numbers between 40 and 60. So New Orleans is 3 times larger than any other city in the Confederacy. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, is what was at stake by the Federals capturing New Orleans. Its port receipts in 1860 were $186 million. 110 million of that in what product? Cotton. You got it. It had 13 major banks, $24 million in capital in its vaults, 12 million of that in gold. Its river commerce in 1861 is estimated at $290 million. And remember, this is 1860-61. Its seagoing commerce was rated at $184 million. It had numerous factories, foundries, all the materials, shipbuilding facilities, all the necessary materials the Confederacy was going to need if it was going to become independent were located in New Orleans. But there's something else about New Orleans that I just mentioned. Let's see if anybody's picked up on it. What else about New Orleans as the war? We all know the general history of the war. What else about New Orleans that was going to be vital to the Confederacy and was one of Lincoln's greatest fears during the whole war?
Mississippi River.
Well, the river. I'm looking for something. That's what I'm looking for. All those foreign-born, there are consulates of almost every nation on the face of the earth in New Orleans. Those consulates had a direct link to those other countries. We're going to talk more about those when I do my Butler talk in June, because that's eventually what does Butler in. And those consulates were what Lincoln feared could possibly lead to European recognition. But from an economic standpoint, you hit the nail on the head. What was so important about the Mississippi River? How big is this drainage basin? Thomas Jefferson made the statement at one time in our history that anyone occupying New Orleans other than the United States of America is our natural enemy, because it controls everything from the Alleghenies to the Rockies to the southern plains of Canada. Everything has to come through New Orleans. It is a bottleneck point, a choke point. And whoever controls it controls the entire interior of the North American continent. That's what gives it its economic power. When New Orleans and Louisiana left the Union, it didn't quite go out with the enthusiasm of a lot of the other southern states. Yes, it had a strong secessionist element. But why do you think maybe there was a little bit... They weren't big fans of Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans, but they were very much in favor of what you would get called the John Bell's party, the Unionist Party, the Cooperation Party. Why do you think, from what we just talked about, would Louisiana be sitting on this fence? Money. The economic ties to the North, exactly. When the vote was taken to elect representatives to the Secession Convention, 20,000, this is statewide, 20,448 for, 17,296 against. In New Orleans, 4,358 for, 3,978 against. That's how close it was. Of course, the convention is called and Louisiana secedes from the Union. Immediately, federal property around the state is seized. This includes the arsenals, it includes Forts Pike, Macomb, Livingston, and of course the 2 forts at the mouth of the Mississippi River, which you were in the trivia contest, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip. Almost immediately, the Union realizes that the Anaconda Plan, once it's put into place, has to come from both directions. Not only are Union forces going to advance from the north, but Union forces are going to begin to advance from the south. It is very shortly after that that the first Union warship, as the blockade is put into place, the first Union warship, the USS Brooklyn, drops anchor off the head of passes, the mouth of the river, and puts the blockade into place. Now, the maps I handed out to you give you an idea of the geography we're going to be talking about. The map on the reverse side of the first page shows how fortified the city of New Orleans was. It is by far the most fortified city in the United States over its history. The final page is a print of, the larger print. Since I was able to drive up here, I usually don't get to lug this along, but this is a print of the attack on Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, that we'll talk more about later. But what I want you to remember now is most Americans have this strange idea that New Orleans is right on the Gulf Coast. It is not. It is over 100 miles by river from New Orleans to the mouth of the river. It's over 90 miles from New Orleans down to Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip. How many have been out to Fort Jackson? A handful. It's not exactly around the corner from the city, is it? No. By the way, if anybody's interested, one of the plantation houses you drove by on the way down there was the plantation house that's used on the Southern Comfort bottle. Maywood? Maywood? Woodland, that's right. Oh, all right. Okay. So, anyway, that's a little trivia there for you. The Confederacy never really fully realized the threat from downriver. The gentleman they placed in command of New Orleans in May of 1861 is a good example of that. Does anybody, if my Louisianans don't get to answer this, does anybody remember who the first Confederate commander of New Orleans actually is? Go ahead, Bruce. You got it. David Twiggs. Ancient War of 1812 veteran, Mexican War hero, barely able to move. He arrives in New Orleans and he's barely breathing, basically. That's what a reputation will get you. But he does not have the energy to begin to build defenses and oversee the defenses necessary to protect the city. Also, there is, again, a terrible misconception about these defenses. How many of you realize that the British Navy tried to get up the river to support General Packingham's attack in 1814, 1815? A couple of you. For 9 days, they bombarded Fort St. Philip. Fort Jackson didn't exist yet. For 9 days, they bombarded St. Philip, and St. Philip repelled each assault. Now, in our history books, it comes down to the brave and skill of the cannoneers inside of Fort St. Philip. Well, if you read the British histories, you get a little bit of a different story. It had nothing to do with the skill of the American cannoneers. It had to do with something else that kept them from coming upriver and helping General Packingham. What do you think that might have been? We're all on the right track. Go above a little higher. The wind. The wind was blowing the wrong way. Remember, these are sailing warships. Well, a little thing called technology had changed since the War of 1812, and the Union fleet that's going to appear off the Mississippi River is no longer dependent on wind, but now on what? Steam. The Confederacy never took into full account how easily a steam fleet could blast their way past these stationary positions. Because of that, the Confederacy began to siphon off all the resources we've been talking about. Men, supplies, ships, artillery, all began to be shipped north to Virginia, to Tennessee, to Columbus, Kentucky. All these, and Twiggs just kind of said, okay, go ahead, goodbye. Just kept shuffling them out of town. And so there isn't much left for him to work with. To give you an example of this kind of laid-back attitude of the defenders of New Orleans, this is my favorite quote that I stumbled across. It was written by a Confederate soldier by the name of George Duval, who was a gambler. I guess that was a profession at that time. He was a member of a unit called Wilson's Rangers, a Confederate cavalry unit. This is what he wrote about this time. We armed and equipped ourselves, and the ladies said we were the finest-looking set of men in the army. If fine uniforms and good horses had anything to do with it, we were a fine body. When we were ordered out to drill, which was every day, we would mount our fine horses, gallop out back of the city, and the first order we would receive from our commanding officer would be dismount, hitch horses, hunt shade, begin playing. There was not a company of cavalry in the Southern Army that obeyed more promptly than we did. We would remain in the shade until the cool of the evening when the orders would be given, cease playing, prepare to mount, march. When we would get back into the city, the people would come out and cheer, wave handkerchiefs, and present us with bouquets, for we had been out in the drilling in the hot sun, preparing ourselves to protect their homes from the northern invaders. It is also at this time that one of the most unique units of the story of the Civil War, in my opinion, and the book up on the table tells their whole story. We're going to talk more about them in June, but I want to mention them now, because they'll eventually be known as the Native Guards. These are free African Americans who offered their services to the state of Louisiana and to the Confederacy and would be part of the Confederate Defense Force that would defend New Orleans. They were accepted into state service by the governor of Louisiana, but they would never be accepted into Confederate service. When New Orleans will fall, these troops will basically be abandoned. They will disband, they will go home, and when General Butler occupies the city, he will bring them back into the service, but under the Union banner. We'll talk more about them in June. The reason I want to talk about them is because they are very unique. We all know the story of the 54 Mast, the assault on Battery Wagon. Well, the 1st and 3rd Native Guard saw action almost 2 months before the 54th did at Battery Wagner at Port Hudson. And Larry knows them very well. We'll talk more about that in June. Now the forts themselves. Those of you that have been out there, you know they are fairly massive. I have had the chance to go over to Fort St. Phillips several times. It's on private property. You can only reach it by boat. And once you get there, you've got to get through the swamps. You've got to dodge the snakes and the alligators and all the other wonderful things you find in the Louisiana swamp. But the fort is still there. Some of its artillery pieces are still there. Fort St. Philip dates from 1797. And as I mentioned, in 1815, it repelled the British attack. Its walls were 20 feet thick by 1861-62. It had a 17-foot-high parapet and mounted 62 pieces of heavy artillery. Fort Jackson, which is a third system fort, would be built between 1822 and 1832. The only reason it basically is still there is because it's floating on a giant raft with cypress logs, keeping it from sinking into the swamp, which I'm afraid is inevitable and is going to happen eventually. It basically had a 25-foot parapet and mounted 74 heavy guns. Including the outer works, these two forts could bring roughly 80 guns at one time to bear on the main ship channel. It's about 1 mile in distance across the river from Fort Jackson to Fort St. Philip in a straight line. Fort St. Philip, as you notice from your map, is a little bit upriver from Fort Jackson. So 80 heavy guns could be brought to bear on any ship that would try to move through. The Confederates also tried some other things. They built a chain across the river. The first time they put the chain in, they put it right down at the water line. Now, I don't want to question their thinking sometimes, but what's a bad idea about putting a chain across the water line, across the Mississippi River at the mouth? Not only sink, but think of all the stuff that's coming down river. It basically built up behind the chain and snapped it. So then the Confederates got a little smarter. They took a bunch of old hulks, and they put them in the river, pointed up and downstream, and they ran the chain between these hulks. These hulks would be damaged by several windstorms because they're elevated, and just before the Union makes their attack, they will send a party, a raiding party, will hack their way through to allow Farragut's ships to make their move. So that really doesn't prove to be very effective. They also came up with something called fire rafts. Basically old ships soaked with any flammable liquid they could get their hands on that would be lit on fire, pushed out into the current, and hopefully stick up against any attacking vessel. The Confederates also tried to put together a river defense fleet. It was basically on any steamer they could get their hands on, as well as a little cigar-shaped semi-submersible vehicle called the Manassas. The Manassas, in October of 1861, actually did try to go down and break the blockade, drove the Union blockaders out to sea for a while, but because it wasn't seaworthy, it had to pull back, and the blockade was put back into place. But the little cigar-shaped Manassas ram is going to be part of this river defense fleet. Basically, by now, though, Twiggs has pretty much done all he can do. He is finally replaced by General Mansfield Lovell, who is much younger, much more energetic, and much more anxious to protect New Orleans. Where are my trivia experts? What's Mansfield Lovell doing before he joins the Confederacy?
He's a street commissioner of New York.
Got it. He's the Assistant Street Commissioner for the City of New York. Ah, you got the job. But Mansfield Lovell is 180 degrees different than General Twiggs. He immediately, one of the things Twiggs was running into is, I don't want to say Louisianans are tight with their money, but they weren't real eager about giving up their land to build defenses. They were not eager about having their enslaved peoples work on these earthworks. But when Lovell gets in there, he basically says, no more choice. You are going to help me build these. In fact, he actually puts together a slush fund, basically, which begins to pay for the creation of these defenses. He also, though, is constantly badgered by Richmond to send off more men, more supplies, and more equipment. And he continues to send off what he can. But he oversees the deciding factor of the story, in my opinion, the deciding factor of this whole engagement. He decides, or the Confederacy does under his direction, to build 2 specific warships. These 2 warships are the key to our story. What is unique about these 2 warships that will be built on the docks, or try to be built on the docks at Algiers, across from New Orleans? They are ironclads. The smaller of the 2 is the Louisiana. It'd be roughly the size of the Virginia, if it's done. The monster they are working on, that Farragut feared immensely, was a behemoth called the Mississippi. If it had ever been finished, it would have been 260 feet long, had a beam of 58 feet, weighed over 4,000 tons, and it would carry 20 pieces of heavy artillery. It would be the largest ironclad warship in the world. It could easily move downstream and destroy any wooden vessel of that time period. There are many Union spies in New Orleans, and they are keeping Farragut and Butler abreast of what's going on those wharfs. They know these ironclads are nearing completion. The Louisiana will almost be finished, but she will never have any engines. She'll never be able to move under her own power. The Mississippi is nearing completion, and that's part of what figures into Farragut making his final decision. Flag Officer David Farragut. Nobody knew much about him yet. In fact, his loyalty to the Union cause at this point in the war is under question. Who remembers Farragut's home state?
Tennessee.
Tennessee. His loyalty to the Union is still in question. But at this point, he is about to prove himself quite loyal. He is going to assemble a force, probably one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful force put together up until this time. Off of Ship Island, off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, he begins to put this force together. It will include 19 13-inch mortars. You've all seen, I'm sure, a 13-inch mortar. You know what those big monsters look like. They will be under the command of whom? Porter. David Dixon Porter. You ever want to read it? Any of you have insomnia? You want a book to put you to sleep? Read Porter's memoirs. I would prefer to finish the first chapter. Trust me on that one. You ever want to read a book about a guy who had a very high opinion of himself? That's the book. Yeah. An infantry force of 15,000 men is being recruited in New England. And it's under the command of whom? Benjamin Butler. Now, one of the unique things, going back to my original introduction, is the people of New Orleans, when they talk about Ben Butler and his troops, you get the idea you're talking about Sherman's bummers in 1864. These battle-hardened, grizzled, mean, tough Union soldiers. These 15,000 green New England farm boys and factory workers couldn't have been more different in the spring of 1862. Many of them had never even fired a weapon, let alone in anger. They are green children, basically, many of them, young men. They are about to be dropped into the Louisiana swamps. You can imagine what it must have been like for them. But this is the force that is going to move toward New Orleans. The Union fleet will eventually consist of 46 warships, mounting a total of 348 heavy guns. And by early March of 1862, they are ready to make their move. Lovell knows they're coming. He has spies out also. He basically declares martial law on March the 15th. He assigns Major Johnson K. Duncan to go downriver and take command at Fort St. Philip and at Fort Jackson. Expecting to find a battle-ready situation, what he finds is entirely different. What Duncan found when he arrived at Fort Jackson, I'll read it to you, is that the backwater resulting from the excessively high river and continually strong eastern winds had flooded the fort. This is Fort Jackson he's talking about. The parade plane and the casemates were submerged from 3 to 18 inches, and notwithstanding the valiant efforts of the officers and men, the water daily gained on them. By isolating the magazine and pumping day and night, it was only with the greatest exertion that the water could be kept out. Living conditions in the fort were almost unbearable, and officers and men obliged to live in the submerged casemates. They were in constant discomfort from wet clothes and feet, thus exposing themselves to the danger of sickness. To a lesser degree, the backwater had created a similar condition at Fort St. Philip across the river. At this point, knowing its engines would never arrive, the Louisiana is towed downriver, and it is placed as a floating battery off of Fort St. Philip. On April 15th, by April 15th, the Union ships had made their way over the bar at the mouth of the river. They had to be light to get over the entrance of the harbor or into the river, but once they were in, they moved to battle position. On April the 15th, Porter moves his mortars into position about 2 miles below Fort Jackson. And he begins a bombardment in which about 1,400 heavy 13-inch shells will be thrown into the fort on a daily basis until it's captured. Now, for those of you that have been in the Louisiana swamps, what's the problem with lobbing a 13-inch shell into a muddy fort from 2 miles away? Yeah, it sinks and then explodes. You're throwing a lot of mud around. Porter was successful in shocking the garrison, keeping them from getting sleep. He was able to destroy the wooden buildings inside the fort, but as far as actually inflicting casualties, did very little, because most of those shells were swallowed up in the mud very quickly and very quickly exploded. Again, remember, this is spring. The river is at high level. It's almost even with the fort itself. And you can see that in print very clearly. 1 a.m., April 24th, 1862. As Hyde before titled his great book, The Night the War Was Lost. Farragut begins moving his fleet upriver. He divides it into 3 squadrons, a first, a lead, a middle, and a last. 17 warships in these 3 waves, mounting 154 heavy guns. As they're moving upriver in the dark, they do something kind of unique. They camouflage their ships as they're winding their way up the river. Now let's see if I've got the former military folks. How would you camouflage a wooden-masted ship coming upriver.
Cypress.
With Cypress, but how?
Hanging from the rig.
Yeah, they put limbs in the rigging. They basically put all sorts of tree limbs in the rigging. So you can imagine yourself being a Confederate sentry at Fort Jackson. You're looking out into this possible little bit of moonlight, a little bit of starlight, and your trees are moving. I don't think they quite knew exactly what was going on. At 3:40 a.m., they figure it out, and the Confederate guns roar into action as Farragut's fleet approaches. It is a point-blank, head-on, hard battle. Porter's guns keep up their bombardment, driving the Confederate defenders off the parapet, off the barbette deck. This picture shows them up on the parapet, but they couldn't stay there very long because of the mortars coming down on them. Basically, it is a close-in fight. By 4:10 a.m., Farragut's flagship, the Hartford, has reached the forts and is running by. One of his officers wrote the following about this moment in the battle. It is quite out of the question to give any idea of the fire at this time, or of the night picture we may bear in the midst of flame, smoke, and iron hail. A shell burst on our deck. I ran forward to see what damage had been done. And when the whine of another shell carried away my cap. We were struck now on all sides. A shell entered our starboard beam, cut our cable, wrecked our armory, and exploded at the main hatch, killing one man instantly and wounding several others. Another entered the muzzle of a gun, breaking the lip and killing the sponger who was in the act of ramming home. A third entered the boatswain's room, destroying everything in its path, and exploded, killing a colored servant who was passing powder. Death and destruction seemed everywhere. Men's faces were covered with powder, blackened and dabbed with blood. They had become a lot of demons in a violent inferno, working fiercely at the business of death. The Confederate counter-efforts, they give it everything they got. Remember I told you the raiding party earlier? They come up and hack their way through the obstruction in the river of the chain, so the ships are able to get by it. They get past the fort under the power of steam fairly easily with only minor damage and a few losses. Once they clear the forts, though, the Confederates launch their fire rafts, and they begin to float down toward the Union vessels. A few of them manage to make contact, including one that actually comes up against the side of the Hartford and actually threatens to put the Hartford on fire. What the Union sailors do is they depress their gun barrels to actually shoot through the side of their own ship and to hit the raft at the waterline and sink the fire raft. And so the Hartford escapes with only minimal damage. But as they clear the fire rafts, the Confederate river defense fleet moves into action. They attack the lead column of the Union Navy head-on. The lead Union ship is the USS Verona. It is quickly surrounded by the entire Confederate fleet, which now consists of about 12 warships, and the Verona is sent to the bottom, the only Union ship to be lost during the battle. Obviously, that does not go over real well with the rest of the Union fleet. So what do you think is going to happen to the Governor Moore, which is the primary warship that sinks the Verona? Yeah, it kind of gets ganged up on by the rest of the Union fleet. It is completely overwhelmed, battered to pieces, and sent to the bottom. Out of a crew of 93 Confederate sailors on the Governor Moore, 57 of them will be killed, and 24 will be captured. The ram Manassas. I mentioned it earlier, the little cigar-shaped Manassas, the semi-submergible. It gets into the fight. It tries to ram several Union vessels, all unsuccessfully. Does no real damage. Farragut had done something else too. He had hung something over the side of his ships to help protect against this little ram. Anybody remember from their trivia what he hung over the side of his vessels? You can see it in the print if you look very closely.
Netting. Chain.
Anybody want to guess?
Netting.
Not netting.
Iron chain.
You're on the right track, though. It's netting of a kind. Iron chain. anchor chain hanging down the sides of the vessel to try to deflect any possible ramming. And it works, because the Manassas is unable to penetrate any of the Union vessels. By 7 a.m., the river defense fleet is by the Louisiana, has destroyed the river defense fleet, and is on its way upstream. As I said, it's about 90 miles between the forts and the city. Most of the Confederate defenses between that 90 miles were never completed. The only substantial work between the forts and the city was the Confederate defense line at Chalmette. How many of you have been to the National Cemetery at Chalmette, adjacent to the battlefield? Did you notice something very odd about that cemetery compared to the rest of New Orleans?
Other than being full.
Well, it's full, yes, I can that.
Below ground?
It's below ground. But why is it below ground? It's higher. It is several feet higher than the rest of the battlefield. Anybody want to venture a guess why from what I've just told you? That's where the Confederate earthwork was. When the Federals take the city, they flatten the earthwork. And that's why that ground is so much higher. That is the remains of the Confederate earthwork. Again, this great war that we talk about, here you have a Union National Cemetery buried in a Confederate, remains of a Confederate earthwork. I don't want to again pick on Confederate engineering, but when they built that earthwork, when they put the artillery into position, they aimed it across the sugarcane fields. They never bothered to put anything facing the river. So when Farragut's coming upriver, as soon as he gets on the flank, he can rake the whole defensive position. And so it's rendered useless very quickly, in a matter of minutes. The Confederates have to evacuate it. The battle is basically over. Union losses are 37 killed, 147 wounded. Confederate losses are 73 killed and 73 wounded. When Farragut arrives at the docks in New Orleans, there are 30,000 bales of cotton on fire. It is total chaos. He looks upriver, and he sees what he thinks is another fire raft coming in his flagship. He prepares to defend against it. But as it gets closer, he notices it's not a fire raft, it's a burning ironclad. It is the remains of the incomplete Mississippi. The ship that they had been so afraid of is set on fire and sent downstream as a fire raft. And so the great ironclad will never be. Now for future archaeologists, the Mississippi continued to float downriver, came to rest somewhere below New Orleans, has long since been silted over. Somewhere out there, one side of the river or the other, underneath all the silt, is the remains of the CSS Mississippi. Someday maybe we'll find her. I never thought we'd find the Huntley. We did. Someday we may find the Mississippi. 2 Union naval officers are sent ashore almost immediately. These guys have to have guts. They basically are going into a hostile. Anyway, we'll close that. They basically are going into a hostile population. They go to Mayor Monroe. All right, that's enough of that. They go to Mayor Monroe, and they basically say, and to General Lovell, and say, we need you to surrender. Well, let's talk about a Three Stooges cartoon. Mayor Monroe kind of goes, well, martial law, I can't surrender. He looks at Lovell. Lovell goes, I'm leaving. You're a problem. I'm out of here. You decide what to do. Well, Mayor Monroe does not surrender right away. He is still hoping. He knows the forts at the mouth of the river are still under control, under Confederate control. He's still hoping for a miracle. Okay, we're back on. So the 2 officers basically demand that the Union flag be placed over the Customs House and the Mint and other federal property. That does take place on the 25th. But on the morning of the 26th, a gentleman by the name of William Mumford, another out-of-work gambler. There seems to be a lot of those in the world. And still, yeah, that's true. William Mumford goes to the U.S. Mint, at the base of Esplanade Street, tears down the U.S. flag, and boasts about it. Remember William Mumford. We're going to talk about him again in June and his fate. He is going to pay very dearly for his actions on May the 26th. The next day, the two officers are sent back, this time with a U.S. Marine detachment, and once again demand the surrender. Again, Mayor Monroe says no. This whole time, the Confederate forces were evacuating the city as fast as they can go, mostly moving up to Camp Moore along the rail line. 27th of April, stalemate. Farragut's getting pissed. I had enough. April the 28th, Farragut sends his officers back and says, I've had enough. You'll either surrender immediately, or I am going to bombard the city and burn it to the ground. I know Larry will agree with me, but knowing Farragut as I think we both do, I have no doubt that had the city not capitulated, he would have definitely opened fire on New Orleans, and what we know is New Orleans today might not any longer exist. Again, remember how high the river is. His guns could have easily have fired over the levee and into the city without any trouble at all. Realizing that Farragut is not bluffing, Mayor Monroe, hearing nothing from the forts, finally surrenders the city on the 29th of April. Now what happens down at the forts? I want you to use your imaginations a little bit. David Dixon Porter's running around down there trying to get the fort surrendered. Basically, Duncan tells him to take a hike several times, at least twice. And so Porter's getting ticked. So he orders Butler, or asks Butler, I don't know if he actually ordered it, but he asked Butler to take his infantry, land them in the swamps behind the forts while they're under bombardment from the mortar fleet, and basically advance on the forts from the landward side. Now this is where I need you to use your imaginations, especially those of you that have never been in a Louisiana swamp. You're a green New England farm boy. You row into this marsh where the mosquitoes are big enough to carry you away. You're rowing past alligators. You're rowing past cottonmouths. Just into this totally alien environment. You've got to hop out of these whale boats and start hiking through this mud, which is up to your waist, much as the British had to do in 1814, 1815. You imagine the shock that these young men must have gone through. But they do reach the fort, and by this point, Duncan realizes he's in serious trouble. But he's not willing to give up entirely yet. On April the 27th, he issues the following order to the garrisons of Fort St. Philip and Fort Jackson. You have nobly, gallantly, and heroically sustained with courage and fortitude terrible ordeals of fire, water, and hail of shot and shell, wholly unsurpassed in the present war. But more remains to be done. The safety of New Orleans and the cause of the Southern Confederacy, our homes, families, and everything dear to man, yet depend upon our energies. We are just as capable of repelling the enemy today as we were before the bombardment. Twice has the enemy demanded your surrender, and twice he has been refused. Your officers have every confidence in your courage and your patriotism, and feel every assurance that you will cheerfully and with great effort obey all orders and do your whole duty as men as becomes the well-trained garrisons of Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip. Be diligent, therefore, and stand by your guns, and all yet will be well. Well, it doesn't exactly have the effect he hopes for. And that night, basically the entire garrison of Fort Jackson mutinies. It says, I've had enough of this, we're going home. And I'll tell you, this is one of the other books that's up here that you might want to read. It tells the story of the mutiny. With Fort Jackson's garrison basically gone, the soldiers at Fort St. Philip know they can no longer hold out. And on April the 28th, almost at the exact same time that Monroe was surrendering the city, Duncan will surrender the two forts that Union controlled. Duncan will get on a steamship, he'll go upriver, and on the morning of the 29th of April, he will report to Mayor Monroe that the forts are gone. the fight is over. At 11 a.m. on the 29th, a larger force of Union Marines and howitzers will land at the base of Canal Street and take up position around the Customs House. On the morning of May the 1st, 1862, the first 5,000 of General Butler's infantry will land at the base of Canal Street and set up their headquarters inside the Customs House. The city of New Orleans is in Union hands and will remain so for the duration of the war. The Butler occupation and the beginning of the Union control of the city is what we're going to talk about in June. But at this moment, the Confederacy has lost its major city. Many people ask me often, why did the Confederates not counterattack? Why did they not try to take the city back before the Union forces really had a solid foothold? And there are two reasons, I believe, for this. First off, for those of you that have been to New Orleans, what's it surrounded by? Water! How big is the Confederate Navy? Yeah. The idea of attacking New Orleans across the landward side is pretty difficult. But they were banking on something else. Summer is coming on. And what did the Confederates think would happen to all these green New England farm boys?
Yellow fever.
Yellow fever, exactly. He expected that the Union soldiers would start dropping like flies and they would just come marching back into town. It's not going to happen. General Butler will do something which will prevent that from happening. Not that he knew what he was doing. One of those things where he did the right thing, but he had no idea what he was actually doing as far as averting disease, because of course we didn't know at the time that the mosquito is the transmitting factor for yellow fever. We'll talk more about that again in June. But for the moment, give you a clue. All right, I'll give you this.
Come back if you do.
What do you need to have mosquitoes?
Water.
What kind of water? Stagnant water. What is New Orleans full of?
Stagnant water.
What does Butler find as far as the population of New Orleans, especially its male population, when he gets there? What are these guys all still laying around doing besides gambling? They got nothing to do. So he puts them to work cleaning up the canals, cleaning up the stagnant water, and therefore averting the breeding ponds of the mosquito. So he did it primarily just to get these guys something to do, to keep them occupied, but it turned out to actually prevent the spread of disease. I think there's like 3 cases of yellow fever that summer in New Orleans. So Butler did what he did was to save the Union garrison. Nothing more horrible. And so the city, largest city of the Confederacy, is now firmly in Union hands. Thank you, and any questions I can answer? Questions? Oh, yes, sir.
How much damage was caused to the forts by?
How much damage was done to the forts by Katrina? A lot. Both were not completely submerged, but almost entirely submerged. Fort Jackson is in Plaquemines Parish Park, which would be a county park to us. Its museum was destroyed. The water was almost to the top of the parapet. It has never been, there's all sorts of cracking. It has never been fully repaired. Last time I was down there, it still was not open to the public. I have not been over to St. Phillips since then. I'd imagine the damage over there is quite severe. Both forts are sinking rapidly. As the erosion around the coast is getting worse, the Gulf of Mexico is closing in. Within our lifetime, I would say there's a very good chance we're going to lose both of them. Or at least they're going to be inaccessible. So we have one more direct hit by a 4 or 5 hurricane, that's going to be it. Even the levees are sinking. Yes, sir.
I was interested, you mentioned the cannon at Fort or St. Phillips. Did they bury the casements underground?
No, they're still up. They're still up on the wall. They're still up on their up on there. Where they have a couple of what do we call those carriages? Those metal ones that the robins are sitting on. I'm trying to remember what the name of them. They're right. They're those heavy metal. No, they're post. Yeah. Larry has an excellent point. The history of Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip don't stop with the Civil War. They're used as a Union prison during the war. They'll actually be used by the United States Army all the way up through World War II. There are actually anti-aircraft batteries, or Endicott batteries, stand-air batteries built. There's the heavy Confederate, the Columbiads, the Rocklands are down there from the post-Civil War period. It remains part of the coastal defense system all the way through the end of World War II. And then it's finally abandoned. So yeah, they're still on those heavy iron carriages, some of them are longer. As I said, it's a private ownership, and we really got to be very nice to the gentleman who owns it. You get out there. Yes, sir.
How much easier did this make the blockade effort for the Union?
Oh, once New Orleans is gone, as far as New Orleans is concerned, it's shut. It's
yeah,
done.
but I mean, so for the rest of the blockade effort.
Yeah, it could be all those ships that would have had been used at the mouth of the Mississippi could be shifted to other places along the Gulf Coast. And it doesn't mean the ships don't try to sneak in and out, but they're very few. Yes, sir.
Yeah, wasn't New Orleans a staging area for a lot of the pre-Civil War filibuster movements, like military attempts to take over Central America or Cuba?
Good old Mr. Walker.
Right.
Yeah. And New Orleans' history, the question is about using it as a staging area for the filibusters that attacked, I think, Nicaragua they went into, and Honduras. And New Orleans is a very, very unique place when you look at its full history. When you look at its role in the Texas Rebellion, when you look at its role in the Mexican War, it's a fascinating story with its influences over the Caribbean, of Central America, of Mexico. New Orleans is a fascinating place. It has all this history. Some people thought Napoleon would try to escape and end up in New Orleans, and thereby try to rally the French population. It has all sorts of interesting twists and ties.
It was and is the capital of the Caribbean. That's what I was saying. It is the capital.
And that's what Pye was trying to say with that quote. The French settlement, the Spanish influence, it has a lot more in common. And that's when I put those Acadian cultural centers together. What makes a Cajun different than someone from Nova Scotia is the influences of all the other cultures of Louisiana, of the African American Caribbean, of the Native American. I work with 2 Native American groups who still have reservations in southern Louisiana. One still on their original homeland in Chickamauga, now by Franklin, Louisiana. Again, all these other different influences, the later French, the later Spanish, all these different influences came into the Acadian life to create what we call Cajun today. It is incredibly unique. My Louisianans in agreement with me? No, we're not going to have that discussion. The word Creole means different things to different people, and I could do a whole different talk on that. It all depends on where in the state you're sitting and who you're talking to. You and I
Yankee.
back to the Civil War. Any other questions? Again, thank you, and I look forward to seeing you all again in June.